10 years, and we're still not there
I
yet.
know, but I'm trying to get you the information so it makes sense.
Okay.
And I know that you're a quick study, so this is easy for you, but this helps me going through it. So, okay, so this is two things here. This is what your debt looked like prior to 2010. So you had your 2002 bonds that were about $350,000 a year, and then you had the CAT lease, which was also about $350,000 a year. So your total debt prior to 2010 was about $700,000 a year. That debt existed on the books of the company. Here's the CAT lease that we talked about earlier, and here's the 2002 bond. Remember that they went out this time frame. They were issued in 2002. This just shows from 2010 on. But this is what your debt, don't look at this pink chart yet, this is what your debt looked like before 2010. So your question about debt increasing, actually the debt was already at $700,000 a year once you did that CAT lease, because your 2002 bonds, which had been existing prior to 2002, were $350,000 a year. So you have the 2002 bonds, $350,000, then you add another $350,000 for the CAT lease, and this is what your debt service, and it's important to recognize, this includes interest and principal. We can't ignore interest because that's your obligation.
John, if I could maybe cut in, Heidi, I think you're looking at this page from the offering document. Is that right? The reason that it looks like the doubling is because the offering document only refers to the bonds, and so right here it's only accounting for the 2002 bonds, and so it's disclosed to investors that the net revenues of the system secure those bonds, and so they only care about the outstanding bonds. However, when you add in the debt service on that CAT lease, even before these bonds were issued, you were paying $700,000.
Oh, I see.
This just accounts for your bonds.
I see what it's saying. This is
not that CAT lease.
this was a.
Doesn't make sense to me.
Let me explain. This lease was not under your bond indenture.
Right.
So your net revenues, you had an obligation to pay these bonds, and you had an obligation to pay this lease. But you didn't have. This was not on the same lien basis as these bonds. So this was your total debt service, but this had a priority lien, and this was basically a similar one. So that's the way it was before.
Right.
Was that CAT lease scheduled to end in 2015?
Yes,
So it would have been over, it would have been done with that.
that's correct.
If it hadn't been refinanced.
That's correct. That's exactly right. So here's the $700,000 was kind of the total debt service number that everything else behind here was working towards $700,000. The goal was not to increase the annual debt service of the company more than $700,000. That's what you were paying, and so any future financing had to keep the debt, total debt, interest, and principal on everything at $700,000. So
do you happen to know what the interest rate was on the CAT lease?
it was 4.75. So what we had here then in 2010, we had, in 2012, we had some new bonds added, and this is what the effect of the debt service now looks like. And we'll go to the next page. So this is what your debt looked like here. We call this a debt service curve, and that's what it looked like before. That's the way it was before the next deal. Now we go to the next page. And here's now what it looked like after. Again, the 2002 bonds, they are still outstanding. They're still outstanding, but the CAT lease has been refunded with this 2010 A and B bond, and there was $4.4 million in new money provided to the company. So the company needed the $4.4 million for new projects, and we refunded the CAT lease so we could have the debt service curve below that $700,000. Refunding that CAT lease and stretching that out, the rate actually went from 4.75 to 4.25%. So the rate went down because the CAT lease, we could get more efficient financing in the tax-exempt market, and there was new money bonds issued. Again, this is the 2010 A and B bonds, and this was the result of now your total debt service. Below $700,000 and going out to 2035. You can see that these bonds were wrapped around this bond, the 2002 bond. Okay, nothing was done with the 2002 bond in 2010. Now let's go to the next financing, which is the 2012 refunding. This is the 2012 refunding. It refunded basically exactly the 2012 piece, or the 2002 piece. So it basically picked it up, reduced the rate, and put it back down in the same footprint. There were some things that were unique to the 2002 deal. It had a debt service reserve fund of about $370,000. In 2012, we weren't required to have a debt service reserve fund from a market perspective. A debt service reserve fund is basically cash sitting in an account for the benefit of bondholders. It's a security feature for bondholders, and that was not needed in 2012. And so we eliminated that. There's a negative carry with debt service reserve funds, especially in this environment. So that was eliminated, and the company received about, let's see, the savings were how much on that deal?
The net present value savings were $482,000.
$482,000 in net present value savings by refunding and refunding the 2002 bonds. That represents, what, 13%? 13, 14?
13%.
Which is a very healthy savings. We basically just reduced the interest costs. And so the company saved $400,000 on a net present value by doing that. So that was just a simple, let's pay those, let's defease those bonds, let's refund them and replace them with lower debt. So now this is what your debt service curve looks like. This is your total debt. And the only increase is in 2025 of maybe $25,000 in 2025. So I've taken a long time, Heidi, to get to your question, and I apologize, but I felt like we needed to go through those steps. But this is your total debt service now, and there is not a significant increase in any of your debt, and there's a step down in your debt of about $75,000 to $80,000 starting in 2026.
And Mr. Stewart, what is the length of usability for the CAT equipment? Is it going to last till 2035, or we need to get another one before that?
That question has no answer. The life expectancy of that equipment is based on time between major overhauls. After you do a major overhaul, you extend the life of the equipment to the next major overhaul. And it's specific to the exact machine you're talking about as to what the time between major overhauls.
And that's determined on hours of usage.
And let me just add to that. When we did the refunding in 2010, remember there were two pieces. There was the 2010A and the 2010B. The 2010A refunded the CAT lease, and the 2010B did the new money. The 2010A had an amortization to 2023. So your original CAT lease had matured, or was going to mature in 2015. In order to create room for the debt service, we had to reduce that CAT lease and extend it. So instead of it maturing here, it matures now in 2023. So that's when the financing for the CAT lease, it was extended to 2023, not to 2035.
So we're deferring that 4.8 million till when?
The 4.8 million is paid within this time frame.
Well, it seems like we're deferring it till 2020, right, on the call date?
Well, you're debt free in 2035.
I understand that, but we're deferring the payment on the 4.8 million till 2020, right?
Oh, when it starts, when you start
When it starts.
principal payments, when is that? 2020?
Yeah, the payment on the new money piece, we call it. Those were all the Build America bonds. Those payments do start.
If we're deferring it till December of 2020 and all of it's still callable after that date, then I'm assuming we're not paying anything on it till 2020.
The principal,
Or
you're
You're not paying principal.
that sounds
So
absolutely.
are we accruing interest throughout?
It's accruing interest. You're making principal payments on debt, and you're making your total debt service remains at $700,000 principal and interest.
So you've simply structured all of this just so we keep it the 700,000.
Right.
So we've deferred some of the interest, we've deferred some of the payments, just to
Right.
keep it that number.
Right. Right.
That's why the numbers are different on it.
Exactly. So it's a management of a couple different things. And this will get into the philosophy that you as board members and administration need to make with regard to how do you fund your capital improvements? Do you pay go? Do you save money and do your projects with cash? Do you use bonding as a tool to do the projects? What is your desire? Many utilities get to choose that. That's your choice. A part of this choice includes who pays for that. If you have a pay-as-you-go, are the current ratepayers then paying for projects that will last and are needed for how the system grows? When you put a new transformer in a substation, who should pay that? A new resident or the existing residents? And that's a decision and an argument that you all get to decide. And it's not an easy decision. It's a philosophical decision. But with utility finance, you're really managing your debt service curve. You're not isolating assets. One thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to have financings go beyond the useful life of an asset. We don't want to issue 30-year bonds for a 10 or 15-year asset. Not only is that, again, against the IRS code and would not pass the test, but it's bad utility practice. And so part of our judgment when we come in as your underwriter, we look at the assets, we go through the capital improvement list, we get a determination by the company on how long these assets are going to last. Because again, we don't want to do anything that would be against IRS rules and bad utility practice. And so this, in my opinion, is the most important curve to look at when you're managing your utility. Because this is what your obligations are, and this is what you'll need to pay. And this includes interest. And let me just mention something about call dates. One of the things that I think government accounting does very poorly is recognize interest obligations. When you have a mortgage, you can pay your mortgage off at any time. You go down to Wells Fargo, you get a mortgage, that's great. You can pay it off generally at any time. But with municipal finance, that's not the case. There's something called an optional redemption date. And this optional redemption date is a market-driven concept. Bond investors are saying, listen, like a mortgage, if you buy a mortgage in the 30th year, you're paying a 30-year rate. But that's not the case with bonds. Each one of these years the bonds mature, there's an interest rate, and it gradually gets higher and higher and higher. And that's called the yield curve. And someone who buys a bond out here is paying higher interest than someone who bought a bond here, because this person is taking less risk that you'll pay versus this person that's buying it out 20 years or 30 years. And so that develops the yield curve. Well, when you get a mortgage and you get a 30-year mortgage, you get one rate, and that's the 30-year rate. Well, with bonds, it gradually goes up. And so along with that, investors demand something that's called an optional redemption. The shorter the optional redemption, the better for you. The longer the optional redemption, the better for investors. And so we can get a shorter optional redemption, but then investors are going to say, geez, the marketplace is a 10-year optional redemption. That's normally what we see in the marketplace. Every week, there's $6 to $10 billion of new bonds issued. And those bonds have optional redemptions. And there's kind of a general 10-year par call is what's accepted in the marketplace. Once you get away from that, then it may cost you a bit. We could do a 5-year call, but an investor who buys bonds with the 6th year to the 10th year might say, hey, now my bonds could be called away from me at your choice, so I need a little bit more yield. And that may cost 10 or 15 or 20 basis points. And so every bond has an optional redemption period. And that means that you're locked into paying interest until that call date. And then you could call those bonds either with cash or issuing another bond and refund those, or selling, if you have cash from selling equipment or selling something, you can then pay to cancel those bonds. There's also another way to do that, and that's through an advanced refunding. And that involves setting up an escrow that pays off the old bonds The escrow is invested in securities that's calculated to perfectly pay off your old debt. That's an advance refund. So there's ways to manage this curve as you manage your debt. But this is kind of the shape. It's a very flat shape, and in order to get a flat shape, we refunded that cap lease and extended that out to 2023. If we had left that cap lease in place at 4.75% and issued the new money bonds, then your debt service here would have gone up, a couple $100,000 a year. So refunding the cap lease from an economic standpoint was a slight benefit. So when you compare the cap lease and its payments at 4.75%, and when you compare the refunding, the 2010A refunding bonds that went out to 2023 at 4.25%, the present value calculation of those two numbers, the two debt service streams, were $15,000 apart to your benefit. So you were actually able to extend this cap lease. Let's go back to Jason, back to just the pre-2000, right here. Go one more thing. We were able to take this piece and put it like this. It didn't even go beyond this. It just went to 2023. We were able to take this and make it more level at 4.25%. And from a net present value calculation, it was a little bit, it would never be something you would do for a saver. $15,000 isn't enough to do that deal. But $15,000 wasn't a loss, and it did create the room for your new money to wrap around it.
We also, we front-ended some cash.
And you front-end $624,000.
Well, no, on the cap, we ended up with less payments, or we reduced our payments in the front end of the refinance on that, so we had additional monies.
Yeah, that's what I,
And so it's a restructure.
But on the, when we do the cap, you have that reserve money, so it's $375,000, the company received that back.
And that was not on the cap lease, that was on the
2002 one.
2002
But
lease.
by doing so, it brought cash back.
Right. That's correct.
But in the what I was trying to say about the 2000, or the...
We actually, Chair, I'm sorry, Joe, that $370,000 went in to reduce the amount of refunding bonds. So
But you reinvested back in.
we basically reduced the amount of bonds that were outstanding. Heidi, is it as clear as mud?
I'm still really sad that we deferred that 4.8 million for this long, and it's accruing interest all of this time. I'm really, really sad about that. To talk about kicking the can down the road. Obviously I need to do more research on the exact improvements that happened there and their lifespan and so forth, but I'm just totally amazed that we did that.
And I can't address, the philosophical discussion about that, but I can say, Jason, if you go back to the final debt service chart,
So if we,
Right, one more. Is this it? Okay, this is it. I can say that if you start to look at your debt service curve on an individual project by project basis, then it's going to get, I think it gets hard to get your mind around it, quite frankly. Because again, if you have capital improvements that are required, that are needed, then how are you going to finance them? Are you going to debt finance them? And if you are, how is that going to affect your debt service curve? Or are you going to cash finance them? Or you're not going to do the projects? And if you don't need to do the projects, then you don't have to worry about the financing of them.